Okay, so I'm going to let everyone in now.
Yes. Okay, I've gone through roughly the questions.
Inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Islamic Courses Zoom session titled Revisiting the Classification of Knowledge in Islam, a study of Islamic philosophies of science. And we're very honored and privileged to have Datuk Professor Osman Bakar, who's the distinguished professor of Al-Ghazali, chair of Epistemology and Civilizational Study and Renewal at ISTAC, International Islamic University of Malaysia, and is hosted by our dear friend Dr. Farah Ahmed from the Faculty of Education at Cambridge University. Before I hand it over to Dr. Farah, just a quick reminder to everyone, housekeeping rules. Please keep your phones or devices on mute if it's not already. It is being recorded. If you're not registered, leave your email address here to receive the received link of the copy of the session. And there is a Q&A session. So there's a Q&A session. Please write them down on the chat first, and we will try and get those questions answered. Please keep it relevant to the subject at matter. We do expect people to have read the book at least, or know of the whole classification knowledge. But I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Farah without further ado. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Farah. Welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam. Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to this latest session of Islamic Courses. So today we're hosting Professor Osman Bakar, who is the distinguished professor and Al-Ghazali Chair of Epistemology and Civilization Studies and Renewal at ISTAC. ISTAC is the International, sorry, I forget the acronym now, but it's the center for the study of, study of Islamic civilization. And it's based at the International Islamic University of Malaysia. Dr. Bakar's book, The Classification of Knowledge in Islam, a study in Islamic philosophies of science, is well known, particularly people working in education, looking at Islamic epistemology and how that has a bearing on a range of things. There's a lot of scope. When the book came out in 1998, from what I recall, people felt that there was a lot of scope for drawing on the scholarly work that's in the book in terms of how we can translate that to our practices and our approaches, not just to epistemology and knowledge and classification of knowledge, but education and dealing with a postmodern world. And I think that those are the themes that are still very relevant. Myself, I have a background in Islamic education and developing approaches to education that are more suitable for our 21st century context. And those are the things that I'm interested in. So for me, this book is very, very useful. So what we're going to do today is Professor Bakar is going to do a short presentation, about 20-25 minutes of his book. And then I will ask a few questions that I've prepared. And then we will open up the floor. So this is going to be hopefully a dialogue, inshallah. But to get us going, if I can invite Professor Bakar to give an outline of some of the core themes that emerge in that book. So over to you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening here, and I suppose it's afternoon there in the UK. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about this book of mine, the title Classification of Knowledge in Islam, and with the subtitle Philosophies of Science, of the philosophical schools as far as science is concerned. Actually, the book was first published in 1991. 1991, that was, but it was only published in UK in 1998, as you mentioned. And basically, the whole book is about the issue of organization of knowledge. It's based on the premise that this disorder, the chaos that is going on in human society today is a clear reflection of another chaos, disorder, which is in the field of knowledge, in the field of epistemology. So the belief here is that chaos, disorder in the domain of epistemology will result in the consequences of perhaps a greater disorder in the field of in social life, in human life in general. I think that is the basic assumption. I stand by that. That's why I felt that it is very, very important to go to the issue, the very fundamental issue in epistemology, which is organization of knowledge. How to restore organization, systems, order in the field of knowledge. And my study of the Islamic intellectual tradition clearly shows that there are certain fundamental ideas that underlie this, what we call the quest for epistemological order in the experience of Islam. The two fundamental ideas are the idea of hierarchy of knowledge and unity of knowledge. These two must go together. The question of hierarchy of knowledge is based upon reality. In other words, hierarchy in knowledge is not something which the human mind just comes up out of nowhere trying to solve problems in society. It is not just based upon human experience, because that idea, as argued in the book, is based on the Quran. In other words, the ultimate source of those two ideas, hierarchy of knowledge and unity of knowledge, is the Quran. So the Quran talks about the microcosm. Both the macrocosm and the microcosm are hierarchical in nature. In a sense, ontologically speaking, there are many levels of reality. So the levels of reality in a microcosm and the levels of reality in the macrocosm, to put in mathematical terminology, there's a one-to-one correspondence between the two domains of reality. So that leads to the idea that objects of knowledge are hierarchical in nature, and the subjective, at the subjective level, which is at the level of the subject that knows the object, it is also hierarchical. Hierarchical here, we're talking about the subject, when we're talking about the human subject that knows objects, it refers to different levels of our cognitive organs, starting from our physical senses right to the highest level, of course, the what you call this, the eye of the heart, the Quran, the eye al-qalb, the eye of the intellect, basically, because the intellect is the eye of the heart. And at the objective level, of course, it refers to the revelation, the phenomena of wahi revelation experienced by the different prophets. So there's a collectivity of human beings who have that experience. The in between, you have, of course, the internal senses. Just as we have physical senses, we have internal senses, and then we got the faculty of imagination, the importance of the imaginative faculty as a source of knowledge, and of course also we have the question of the rational faculty. But here, many modern minds are confusing the terms between reason and intellect, when in Islamic intellectual tradition, the two terms are not synonymous. This is important. Reason is not the same as intellect. It was the same thing in the Latin world. In the Latin world, during the medieval period, I mean, they also distinguish between ratio and intellectus. So in the case of the al-Farabi, one of the figures whom I discussed in the book, he made that distinction. So basically, when we refer to reason, we are referring to the partial intellect. In Arabic, as al-aql al-juz'i, when we refer to the intellect, that refers to the universal, the reason that is able to see, to experience knowledge in a different way, in the same way that the physical eye sees things without any intermediaries. So the same thing with the intellect. So all these terms are very, very important in the book. In fact, I would say that for readers, it is important that sometimes I'm using the the same words that we use nowadays, but the understanding of those terms is not the same. The question of unity, of course, I mean, that is a consequence of the divine unity itself. We know very well that Tawheed is the essence of Islam. Tawheed basically the idea of unity of God. But that unity of God has consequences on the unity of knowledge, on the unity of creation, the unity of the cosmos, the unity of life, the unity of state. Basically, whatever unity you want to talk about, that is basically the consequence of the unity of knowledge. So since there's so many different kinds of knowledge, so it doesn't matter in a sense, precisely because we have that Tawheed, there cannot be contradiction between any two branches of knowledge. So the kind of what used to be called in the West, the two cultures, the clash of the two cultures, the clash of the scientific, the so-called the sciences and the humanities, that did not happen in Islamic tradition, precisely because of this concept of unity of knowledge. So that is the comprehensive framework in which I try to study the different branches of knowledge that were known to Islamic civilization, beginning with al-Farabi, then al-Ghazzali, and then Qutb al-Shirazi. They offer different systems of knowledge as far as details are concerned, but the book shows that I try to reduce certain commonalities in the sense that in what way the three scholars shared in terms of epistemology. So basically, that was what I tried to do. And I pointed out, I mean, it has practical consequences. The classification of knowledge has practical consequences for librarian science, for example, those who are still trying to classify, books in libraries and so on. But this is also basically education, basically. I mean, for example, al-Farabi's classification is basically it was his classification. It was a kind of a curriculum that he designed based on this hierarchy of knowledge, and also in terms of the sequence, which branch of knowledge should be studied first in order to train a scientist, for example. It's basically it was a curriculum design how to train philosopher-scientists. I think that is very important, this combination of philosophy and science. So I suppose that's roughly just for your knowledge. So I'm very happy that this book has received very good responses. It has been translated into Indonesian language. Talking about 200 to 250 million people speaking the language. It has been translated into Turkish, into Persian, partially into Urdu, and now it's being translated into Arabic, inshallah. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bakar. So, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. So, I was wondering, could you elucidate a little bit more on this notion of philosopher-scientist that you mentioned towards the end? Why is this so significant? What is the significance of al-Farabi not talking about science separately and not talking about philosophy separately? Why should we pay attention to that?
Well, we are talking about in the field of knowledge, it is very, very important for science to know philosophy and for philosophy to know science. So the relationship is reciprocal. It's not, philosophy and science. And it happens that most of the Muslim scientists in the past were not just scientists in the modern sense, but they were scientists who know and who feel that their quality as scientists, in terms of knowledge, in terms of how they view the world, in terms of your reality, that depends on how much philosophy. It's a very, very simple thing. Let's say today we want to teach biology, for example. So we are not just making technical knowledge to students about the questions, nowadays, of course, talk about microbiology, study of cells, and so on. But where is the underlying reality? You're talking about the reality there. So you want to talk about evolutionary biology and so on. All right. I mean, you have to talk about life. But what is life? Has science really found the answer to the question, what is life? No, they're still debating what life is. Now, because of the COVID, the coronavirus, now they talk about what is this coronavirus? Is it really a living thing or what? Scientists are divided. Some say, yeah, see, well, it is partly living, partly not. In other words, but they all agree that ultimately falls to the question, the answer, what is life? But to go to that question, what is life? You need philosophy. So here is a question that the two need each other. That was the spirit in which the Muslim philosophers, the Muslim scientists, in terms of disclassifying this knowledge.
I think that's an excellent example to sort of outline why science without philosophy is going to be hobbled. It won't be a full experience. I think another example would be the challenge that's been posed by this idea of gender being different to biology. And so I think these two examples would indicate to us that why, as Muslims, this unity of knowledge that is necessary, that we don't see a philosophical discipline or kalam or theology or even a fiqh or science as things which are separate. They all need to be brought together to deal with the realities that we face. And so that leads me on to onto my next question, which is that the three thinkers that you've identified, and they're very significant scholars, as you've mentioned, al-Farabi, al-Ghazali, al-Shirazi. All three of these scholars, they come in a sequence historically. So you can see it in your book. You've traced a history of development of ideas. You can see you traced how Ghazali responds to Farabi as well as other thinkers, and then how al-Shirazi responds to them both. I mean, it's very significant for to recognize that they were philosopher-scientists, and they were also interested in the arts and interested in a range of, they were, what in the West was termed the Renaissance man, was something that was a common theme for ulama of that time. But the question I'd like for you is, could you just tease out, and I know it's difficult to do, and the whole book is there to do that, but could you just tease out some of the differences between al-Farabi's epistemological stance and then Ghazali's and then Shirazi's, just to give us an understanding that this was a very dynamic dialogue that was happening at that time, and that the epistemological stances that they were taking were driven by by real questions that they were trying to answer at that time. I wonder if you could take a few minutes to do that.
Yes, I mean, basically why I chose those three figures, al-Farabi, al-Ghazali, and Qutb and Shirazi, because they belong to different schools of thought, different schools of philosophy, in a sense. Yeah. So the idea of mazhab, I'm not talking about the legal schools here. So as far as legal schools, Muslims are divided. You have the Sunni and the Shia, and the Sunnis, the Hanafi, the Shafi, and so on. So that is as far as the legal domain, the legal ethical domain is concerned. But when it comes to intellectual issues, the question of about the cosmos, the question about creation, the question of the meaning of creation, the question of metaphysics, the question of God, the meaning of God, and so on. All these Muslim intellectuals were divided into different schools, in the sense that they approach a particular issues from the particular way, they emphasize certain doctrines. That's what happened. So they were all Muslim, they all accepted Islam, they all they have to interpret Islam, but interpretations may vary. That's the example, the difference between al-Ghazali and al-Farabi. Now, here is a question of the extent of the use of reason. How much reason should be used in this, especially in the study of philosophy, in the study of society, and so on. Now, Al-Ghazali belongs to the Kalam school, the school of Kalam, which believes a kind of trying to see also a kind of delimitation of the human reason. So under what conditions, those under what conditions you have, why the people or why scholars of that school believe that why revelation is necessary. It's not to say that al-Farabi say revelation is not necessary, but al-Farabi gives greater freedom to the use of reason, and it is less in the case of the school of Kalam. So the question of what I pointed out in the book, that ultimately it was done to the same thing, because okay, when al-Farabi talks about reason in its positive aspect, he was looking at the potential of reason, ignoring the pitfalls of reason, knowing what are the kind of, for example, reason being this kind of constrained by our passional soul, That, but al-Farabi did not talk about that. He talks about intellect that is healthy. The word he used was salim, meaning that he referring to a healthy intellect. In the case of healthy intellect, these are the potentialities that you can arrive, you can achieve. You can even arrive at metaphysical truth independently of revelation. Al-Ghazali look at issue from different angle. He look at it from a different angle that, well, human being have this lower passion, has this passionate soul. Now, each passionate soul is allowed to grow, is allowed to develop to the extent that it corrupts the intellect. That was what he was concerned. So, you know, it's not that they were against each other, but it's that they emphasize the different things. I think it's important to realize that. So in the case of Qutb and Shirazi, of course, he belonged to that a scientist that we understand in the modern sense. But then he also was a philosopher. He was a philosopher. In other words, but his philosophy is to the extent that it is relevant, it is necessary to his science. So a different kind of intellectual. I think of the three, if you want to talk about from the current perspective, our contemporary perspective, Qutb and Shirazi would be a better example, you know, to compare with the modern contemporary scientific mind.
Okay, no, thank you for that. I'm just thinking whether we want to move to questions from the audience, but I think before we do that, if I can ask one of the questions that I've prepared for you. So when we are looking at, okay, so they're both, all these thinkers are coming to their conclusions and the debates about this from a particular epistemological stance, which is to do with, which is driven by the reality of the situation around them. And I think that is very significant, that the issues that they're facing and dealing with, their philosophy and their science and their writings are addressing those issues. So they're not theoretical. And I think that's significant. But the question, and as you said, al-Farabi is in a way, he's trying to form a curriculum for higher education. But the question I've got for you is, so that when we're looking at these hierarchies of knowledge, and it is significant, it's a very important thing to recognize that we have these hierarchies in our tradition, and yet you've got this unity. But what does that mean for us today when we're considering curriculum? Okay, and I don't just mean at the higher education level. I mean at the sort of secondary education and even primary education. If we as educators want to draw on this heritage and draw on this history, how can we translate this notion of hierarchies and the way these hierarchies are formulated into, if we were to design curriculum from scratch from an Islamic basis, how would you address that?
Well, I think this issue needs to be addressed differently at different levels of education. Of course, I mean, this is it's a lot of things that need to be addressed, but the question of here to, it has to be related to religious education as well. That's the thing. If you want to talk about science education that is divorced from spiritual education, from moral education, for example, then it's very difficult to appreciate the kind of approach that I presented in the book. So in other words, there are certain principles that we have to defend. For example, the idea of God. So if you want to do away with the role of God in knowledge, in creation, and in universe and so on, you take it out, then it is very difficult. So in other words, the validity of my thesis in the book is, of course, in the context of society in which the idea of God is meaningful. The idea of that the universe, the cosmos, is originated by a divine reality, for example, that has to be accepted. But just say, for example, you talk about the hierarchy, for example. I want to talk about at the level of all right. I mean, in terms of the creation, the Muslims believe in the angels. All right. Angels are particular entities, particular species of living things. Now, what is their nature? What is their role and function in the cosmos? These are relevant questions. These are relevant questions. And then what is the link between these creatures and the world of nature that we study in science? There is that role. But the question now, how do you present this role, this function? Perhaps it's quite different from the way it's usually presented in religious subject, for example. This is important, that in Islamic tradition, in Islamic history, the religious teachers, as we say, religious teachers who teach in the ustaz, who teach in the madrasa and so on, may adopt a different approach in teaching about creation compared to the scientists. The scientists also talk about the creation, but a different way. And I mentioned in the book that even for that the scientists, not just Farabi, but also Ibn Sina and others, for example, they even use certain technical terms, scientific, for angels. They use the word angel because angel is a religious term, but the nature of the angel is presented as demanded by the Quran, by the Hadith, is preserved in science, but they go for different terminology to make it more appealing to the scientific mind. So that it's not a question of uniformity between somebody teaching a religious subject and somebody teaching science within the context of religious perspective, Islamic perspective. It may not be the same. So I think but the question now, all right, in terms of hierarchy, what is the hierarchy between angels and then the subtle world, which we associate with the world of the jinn, for example, the subtle. The jinns are also a domain of reality. They also have their function in nature. Then you have, of course, the physical things. So just to appreciate that there is a hierarchy is to distinguish between inanimate objects and animate objects. They are not the same. Which is higher? Of course, the living one is higher than the inanimate or the object. In what sense they are higher? Because they have something extra. They have something extra in terms of information, in terms of power, in terms of to the non-living things. So just when we distinguish between living things and non-living things, we also see a hierarchy there which occupies a higher level ontologically speaking in terms of the life, for example, because to have more complex life is to be superior to a simple life. Even in ordinary language, you don't have to study classification of knowledge and to use the hierarchy. If we think carefully, when we talk about living things and non-living things, we also make a distinction already. in terms of one is different from the other, one is higher than the other relative to certain properties. So it's just that somehow we don't use that word hierarchy. But in reality, the idea of hierarchy is in our mind, in the way we present things when we study.
Okay, so if I can just comment a little bit briefly on that. So my background is I've been working in Islamic schools, as I said, for a few decades now. And one of the things I think that is really important is that we don't transfer our own sort of separation of science and religion to children. So one of the things in our schools is that when you talk to young children, and I remember I've asked children this in the past, I say to them things like, and I'm talking about 8-year-olds now, that do you know that some people think that if you're a religious person, then you can't be a very good scientist because you can't be a very good scientist, or you wouldn't be the best scientist. And they're really, this blows their mind. They're just really shocked. They're really shocked that you have this idea that religion would somehow taint science in any kind of way. And their response tends to be, but why? Why would this be the case? This is what we're doing. We're Muslims, and we're interested in science. And when we learned about Muslim scientists in the past, religion was what drove them to find out more. So then it's not a natural thing that you're not born thinking that science and religion has to be separate, but actually our systems of education and the way that we structure our thought in the contemporary world is what is bringing this problem to the fore. So one of the things that I would argue is that actually in our educational approaches, we need to bring a more holism, more tawheed into our knowledge. And yet at the same time, children are very conscious that knowledge of Quran is a higher level of knowing than when they're doing a science experiment. They don't see a parallel between the two. They don't see them as equal. They know that there's an adab to the Quran. And so there are core sort of like fitra type understandings that need to be drawn out from a young age and then built upon in secondary education and then developed further in higher education. And one of my arguments about this, when I look at the Islamization of knowledge literature, or you look at all the different movements that are out there, is that when, as academics, we're just talking at the higher education level, and we're not thinking about education more holistically as a system, as a community, as a society, what's happening in schools. I don't know if you want to comment on that. To me, that's really important.
Well, this perhaps I think what we mean by religiosity. I think that's also part of the problem that why we have quarrel, we have differences on this matter, on the subject that you're talking about just now, is precisely because we have certain understanding of what to be religious means. So you apply, perhaps that religiosity is defined by certain subject. Let's say, what do you call the religious, the so-called religious subject, religious knowledge. And then you want to apply it to science. And the person who studied religion, we look at it, that is not what religion wants us to do, what religion wants us to know. But then the person who studies science, the person who is doing science, has different thinking about a certain thing. But why should, as long as that person, that science, the person who studies a science, try to relate their subject matter to God, to Allah, which is basically that is ultimately what it means. What do you mean being close to God? The question of to be close to God, is it only through a certain subject that you are brought closer to God, but not to another subject? That is not the Islamic thing, really. That's not really what Islam was about. That was the argument. Basically, that was the argument between the scientists and the non-scientists. And in the case of Western history, that was the debate. The central thing about the debate between the church and the scientists. Because the church believes that in order to know God, you have only to study the Bible. You have to study the scripture. But the scientists say, no, we can also know God through the study of another book, which is the book of nature. This question. I'm sure today there are many Muslims, who are in general they appreciate that, but it comes to the details. No, I mean they don't think that way. The question is, how can we be close to God through knowledge of the natural world, through the knowledge of creation? Of course, we cannot just set aside the Quran, but then of course we study the Quran and the book of nature in a kind of interactive way, basically. So I think there are a lot of issues to be looked at for education today. For example, how through science education we can bring our students to the knowledge of God, to the knowledge of Islam, rather than through another way. Basically, in a sense, we talk about the natural science being the lowest, and you mentioned it several times. How today, in the case of classical perspective, natural science considered as at the lowest, but that lowest, not in terms of its efficacy, in terms of bringing us to God, but rather it's more in terms of its social function. It's something else. Yeah, the Muslim scientists in the past would defend the idea that in terms of epistemology, in terms of ontological perspective, biology would occupy a lower position than angelology, for example, the study of angels. But they did not. But then there's the Sharia. The Sharia also talks about the concept of usefulness of knowledge in society. In fact, in my book, I talk about different bases, not just one basis of classification. Of course, so the ethical basis in terms of the usefulness of things. So natural science is very useful from that point of view, but it's also useful at another level in terms of that by knowing nature, our iman can also be improved, can be increased. So scientists can increase their iman through another way. Just historians can increase their faith through the study of history. There are so many, there are 1,001 doors to God. There's not just one way to the knowledge of God. I think that is the perspective of the Quran. Every part of creation will lead us to God. And our minds are structured in such a way that we are different from each other in terms of our own interests. We are good at different things. We are interested in different things. So in the sense that there is a share for everybody. We can say, excuse, like Bertrand say, why God, that British philosopher said, complained about why God did not create enough evidence that he exists. I mean, that is ridiculous for us. I mean because for us, the evidence is everywhere, but it may not be for everyone. Your evidence is different. You concentrate on certain evidences. Other individuals concentrate on other evidences, but they all lead to God. I think that is a very important thing.
Oh, Jazakallah khairan, thank you for that. One thing I would add to that is perhaps one of the things we need to consider is whether we separate out the disciplines, the subjects a little bit too early, perhaps to sort of build this concept of the unity of knowledge and different strands of learning leading back to the same place, to the knowledge of God. What we could do is have in our schools a more of a project-based or an inquiry-based form of learning. So, for example, if you give children a theme or a topic and then they are asked to ask questions about that, and those questions may lead them to some scientific inquiry, but they may lead them to some historical inquiry, but then they see the relationships between these things, and they begin to understand the relationship between art and history and science, so that the disciplines are not entirely separate. Not only are they sort of a vertical variation of paths to to a unity of knowledge, but they also have relations between them. And that if we can build that understanding from a young age, I think what we found in some of the work that I've done is that has an impact on the understanding as young Muslims develop and how they bring their Islam to bear on their practices. And I think that for me, this is our sort of perhaps one of the most fundamental questions of our time, is that instead of trying to resolve these issues when young Muslims are grown up and then they come with questions which are difficult for us to answer, or challenges that we didn't face when we were young, we can give them the tools to think laterally, to make connections, to start considering different ideas, but understanding that there is a unity of knowledge that comes through revelation and comes through illumination, and it comes through reason and comes through all these kinds of ways, but give them the skills to be able to make those connections, which will help them navigate the world that they find themselves in. So I think this is really significant, and your work actually has much to add to that, and it's now for educators to pick it up and do something with it. But I also feel that it's a responsibility of us in academia to reach out and work with people who are dealing with the practical problems on the ground. So I think that's a very useful way forward. But I'm conscious of the time, and I want to come to some of the questions. At the moment, I have two questions from the audience. So one question is from Steve Olende, and he's asking that if I'm understanding, the Western understanding of what became science was started by natural philosophers. So Western science arises out of natural philosophy, who were trying to understand God's creation. And he's saying that he would hope there was a set of values behind any exploration, though that would color what was scientists or natural philosophers were studying. And I think you write about this quite a lot in your book when you talk about the sort of ethical issues in the hierarchy of knowledge. So I wondered if you wanted to comment a little bit about the ethics of studying science or studying natural philosophy.
Well, if you're asking question just about the ethics, I mean, there's a very, very precise thing, because in my book, I talk about not just ethics of knowledge, but also the what they call in terms of methodology, what they call this methodological basis of classification of knowledge, and the other one, of course, the ontological. I already mentioned ontological just now. In terms of methodological, this is the idea. It's very, very important point to realize. Modern science reduced methodology to one simple method. What they call is the scientific method. Basically, it is the empirical method of observation and experimentation, and then a kind of trying to disown what used to be accepted by different civilizations as possible, legitimate, most of knowledge. Now, in Islamic civilization, there was the general belief that there are many different ways to knowledge, different modes of knowing, so that's why, and that's accepted by the scientists also. Today, the scientists, the professional scientists, accept the so-called empirical method. They will not accept other means of knowing. So that, for example, if you make a certain claim, that claim cannot be verified by the empirical method, then they won't accept. And that is the contention between the religious perspective and the scientific perspective. But that's important. I'm saying that that's very important. It's not an ethics, but just to mention that issues of methodology is very very important. So a scientist of the caliber of Avicenna or Ibn Sina, for example, in his writings, he accepts that it is possible to know apart from through the empirical method of observation using the five senses. Even revelation, for example, revelation is source. Revelation, wahi, in order to accept what is the Quran as valid, as legitimate for the purpose of scientific study, that is an important thing. Now, better question here is, of course, the question of ethics. Well, first, philosophically speaking, is simple. I mean, knowledge is such a vast domain. It's an ocean. To use the symbolism of Quran, the symbolism that knowledge, I mean, if God, increase the number of options into ink, for example, and to write the creation, then it would dry up before you are able to do so. The point is knowledge is such wide. So, individually speaking, I'm not talking about civilization. I'm talking about for the person, for a particular person, individual. We live only for a certain period of a number of years. All right. So knowledge is very vast, and yet knowledge is necessary. So here the question of, in order to live a full person, to lead a full life during the number of years that we live on this earth, you have to make choices. There's no way that you can learn everything. So therefore the question of this, that's why the Prophet often prayed, then I pray to God, I seek protection from knowledge which is not useful. Knowledge does not benefit us. So it's not the knowledge there, the problem there is not knowledge per se. Knowledge per se. But here the question of what kind of knowledge is useful to us as individuals and to us as members of society. So we have to grab that. That is basically the idea of ethics of knowledge. So now science has released itself from that. It's tried to be independent of ethics. Before, ethics was a very important factor in determining in which direction should research go, for example, so study. But now, the virtue is not there. The virtue now is originality. If you think that you are the first person to discover something, do something, then go for it, even if it's not ethical. But that is something that's kind of accepted by Islamic ethics of knowledge, right? So
we've got a lot of questions coming.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, Professor. We actually have quite a few questions coming in now, and they look like some very important questions. So I'm going to try and go through them a bit more quickly. So we have two questions from Gohar, who's saying that, what is your viewpoint on the relationship between Islamic religious sciences and Islamic philosophy in terms of hierarchy? So what's the hierarchical relationship between the two? And he would also like to know what you would suggest regarding the epistemological absolutism that you find in contemporary Muslim scholarship.
Can you repeat the last one, please?
Okay, so he wants to know what you suggest regarding the epistemological absolutism within Muslim scholarship, so that there is a tendency now in scholarship, from what I've understood of the question, that there is only one answer, as opposed to having khilaf or difference in answers, and what your response to that would be.
Well, I think different sciences have different approaches, different perspectives on the pursuit of on the pursuit of knowledge. For example, let's talk about religious sciences. In the case of the Islamic experience, we'll talk about religious sciences. You're referring to the jurisprudence. You're referring to the principles of jurisprudence, usul fiqh. You prefer to kalam, basically, because the nearest to philosophy is kalam. In a sense, is a philosophy, but it's a different school of philosophy. It has its own basic assumptions, and also adopt certain approaches, methodological approaches. So here you see a difference between kalam and falsafa. Al-falsafa, to which al-Farabi belonged, for example. Well, the fact that for hundreds of years they were debating each other shows that, I mean, this you cannot get a consensus. It's not a question that you get consensus. You just pick your choice. I mean, which one is appealing to you. But the point, Islam provides that opportunity for the Muslim minds, to study these different possibilities. Some people are attracted to the falsafa approach, in a sense, because it looks more rational, greater freedom given to reason compared to the so-called religious sciences of Kalam, for example. Al-Ghazali is very interesting. Al-Ghazzali belonged to the school of Kalam, but he but although he was a scholar of Kalam, he saw the limitations of Kalam in certain respect. So he felt that Kalam did not meet his certain intellectual needs. So he went to look for other things, for philosophy. He read philosophy, and then finally into Sufism. So you have that kind of things happening in Islam. And to me, I'm not worried at all about having different schools of thought. What is important is that the different schools of thought free enough or tolerant enough to discuss with each other, to debate with each other, and not to accuse the other of being un-Islamic or being out of the field of Islam. They are all Muslims. They believe in the same fundamental and so on. Now the question how to approach knowledge. In fact, personally, I like that, to see this diversity in schools of thought, especially intellectual schools of thought, because that has enabled this Islam to produce what I call creativity, that phase of creativity, the golden period of Islamic intellectuality.
Yes, and I think that in your book you draw out the differences in relation to the religious sciences and Islamic philosophy, the three different thinkers and how they interact with these in different ways, which actually is very beneficial because it shows the level of commitment that they made to trying to get to grips with this question. Is quite a challenging question. And there's a sincerity that you sense in reading these ulama from the past, or why they're trying to ask these questions and how they're engaging with it. And they're coming up with different answers, but they are all seeking the same truth, the same haqq, which is important. So I have the next question is from Umar, and it's another challenging question. So has the Islamization of knowledge failed? And is it still relevant?
Well, yes, we are going into a subject which has been very hotly debated, in fact. But now I see that, at least in Malaysia, I don't know in other parts of the Islamic world, I think in Malaysia, somehow this issue has come to a halt. People don't have anything new anymore to say about Islamization. And I have been asked also, what I think of the current state, the status of the Islamization of knowledge. My answer is that what has been done all this while in answering the question, do we need Islamization of knowledge, to what extent, and so on, we have not really gone into the real epistemological issues. What do you mean by to Islamize knowledge? First of all, of course, I I want to answer this, to bring up this issue. Some people who bring up this issue of, well, we don't need Islamization. What we need is some sort of integration. It's a question of terminology. Because Islamization, say, we put off non-Muslims from participating in the debate. But based on my experience in Malaysia, in our part of the world here, in Southeast Asia, I've always argued that the term Islamization of knowledge is useful, if not necessary, is useful for the Muslims, because we are trying to relate issues of knowledge, of epistemology, to the religious consciousness. So by connecting the epistemological issues with Islam, the teachings of Islam, it would make it easier for the minds, for the Muslim in the mind, to make the connection. If you remove the word Islamization, you go for a more neutral term. That is also possible, but only certain minds would see the relevance. But others may say, well, it's nothing to do with Islam. So that's why I say Islamization knowledge is important as an ummatic project, as a project for the ummah, not the project for the whole of humanity. So we are not presenting Islamization of knowledge as a proposal, as a project meant for non-Muslims as well. Although non-Muslims may get some benefits from the Islamization of project. Personally, of course, I maintain both. So when I discuss with fellow Muslims, it's easier when I use the word that is related to Islam, Islamization. But I also interface dialogue with people of other religions on epistemological issues, on the question of religion and science. I will not use Islamization. I use the question of integration. But then I still have to explain what the integration is. Because what do you mean by integration? What is being integrated? Who is doing the integration? What sort of mind is doing the integration? We cannot run away from that. Now we talk about Islamization. We're talking about the mind that is supposed to Islamize. Or we use the word integration. We don't talk about the mind that is doing the integration. So it falls back finally to who is the person? Who is that mind which is doing either Islamization or integration? Then that goes back to the same issues that I brought up in classification of the book, classification of knowledge. You cannot run away from those issues, regardless of what terminology that you want to use. The substance of knowledge, that is involved, that is more important to understand. It's not the terminology. So, yeah.
No, thank you. I think that's really important. A lot of questions come out of this because actually what we're saying here is the more fundamental question is what we understand knowledge to be in the first place. So it's an epistemological question which is really at the core of the Islamic tradition in so many ways, because the concept of knowledge, or ilm, or arifa, these are very fundamental concepts that impact us in all sorts of ways. Another comment that I think is relevant, which is quite significant, is that there is a movement now in the academy of people talking about indigenization of knowledge. By this, what they mean is non-Western ways of knowing. So, for example, in New Zealand, you have Maori people talking about how they don't think and they don't understand knowledge the same way that, you know, from the Western education system that's being imposed upon their children. And to me, I think this is quite a significant point. And I've written a little bit about this in relation to what is Islamization a form of indigenization? Where does this fit in? And the reason I think that, of course, I think that in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. As with anything, there's usually nuance. But the reason I think it's a significant argument to make, or something to consider, is because ultimately what your book is actually saying is that the way we understand knowledge and what we understand knowledge to be, how we approach that has a great bearing on how we approach the world. And that those classifications of knowledge were ways to understand the world at that time from an Islamic basis. And actually, perhaps what's needed in whether you use the term Islamization or whatever, this movement which is there and will remain, because until Muslims find a more sort of a unity in their thinking, and they're not having to think between Western ways of knowing and then Islamic ways of knowing, and they're not having to keep this separate and go move from one to the other, until we find some sort of unity, whether they use that term or not, these issues remain important. And again, the final thing I'd say to that is that it actually does, as I said, for me, one of the core things that we've missed is that we've been working at this at simply the higher education level. And education doesn't start in adulthood, it starts in childhood, and we need to consider that issue. So I hope that helps to add to the question that was asked previously, but I want to move on to the next question because we don't have much time now. And there's a couple of questions from Yasmin. Yasmin is asking how Muslim majority states, for example, Malaysia and Indonesia, can practically demonstrate this unity of knowledge within their teacher training institutes and in school-based curriculum delivery, and what are the examples of best practice in this practical application in schools in the world? So she's asking, I suppose, the same question that I'm posing, is that how do we bring these very complex higher education ideas, academic ideas into our schools? And how can we make a transform the practice in our schools through training and through curriculum?
Well, I see at a practical level the cooperation that exists now between institutions in Malaysia and Indonesia, for example. I'm very happy to see. I mean, the greater collaboration, both at the level of the what I call this universities and colleges, but it's also NGOs. I mean, the private institution dedicated to basically Islamization of knowledge. So now they try to branch out into different aspects of the Islamization, looking at the curriculum, looking at the teachers' training. So compared to 30 years ago, for example, I would say that in terms of activities, they are more numerous now. But again, the question, I mean, we need the contribution of different groups. I would say those who are well versed in epistemology, we need to increase the number of people, of the experts in this field. It may not, we don't maybe that many. Sometimes, you know, it's not the question of the number, the question of how effective our voice in presenting the Islamic epistemology, for example. So I think one thing is good now. What is good nowadays is that, I mean, we are able to communicate easily with different parts of the world. So I'm sure if the right ideas, if they know the right ideas, the right kind of discourse is taking place, you'll be able to make a lot of meaningful changes among Muslims today, especially among the younger generation. I would like to see that. But to me, I mean, the one thing that I'm worried is that many of us are thinking that tradition is not important to us. To me, it is very, very important to know our intellectual tradition and then apply that to our contemporary issues and so on. Because of new advances in now in the biomedicine, in the microbiology, and so on, it's very interesting. It's very interesting. Some people come to realize that what our classical biologists were talking about, yeah, may not provide the answer to some of the questions they're asking about coronavirus and so on. So please do not think that, I mean, what Ibn Sina talked about, al-Farabi talked about centuries ago, it's only good for the time, it's out of date. This is a question now, we are somehow with this idea of this out of date, you know? But not everything that they presented is out of date. They are relevant at all times. So my concern is that our younger generation does not know, I mean, does not study enough about our intellectual tradition. You mentioned earlier about the postmodernism question. Now, if you want to try to deal with the issue of postmodernism, we have to bring in the knowledge of the past. For example, well, my question is, we have used the word postmodernism very, very freely, eh? But from the viewpoint of epistemology, postmodernism does not have a coherent epistemology. That is my thesis. So if you want to criticize postmodernism, what is that coherent epistemology? No. There are many schools of postmodernism. They all disagree with each other. The only thing they agree is that they reject modernism. But what is that answer to modernism? They are still looking for it.
I think, thank you for that. But I mean, just in terms of Yasmin's question, I think from what I've understood of the professor's work, the point that's being made here is that for me, teachers need this, like teaching should be a profession. By teachers, I mean school teachers. School teachers as a profession need some philosophical training. They need some understanding of our religious heritage in relation to what is knowledge, in relation to how we learn, in relation to classification of knowledge, in relation to the relationship between reason and revelation. And these kinds of concepts for whatever subject they're teaching are really fundamental for them to understand how their teaching would lead to a more holistic or Islamized or integrated, whatever term you want to use, approach to learning and knowledge. And so I think teacher training, as Yasmin's pointed out, is actually quite fundamental. And perhaps one of the things we need to be looking at is in our departments of philosophy in the Muslim world, places like ISTAC, places like Ibn Khaldun, the kind of universities that are moving forward in this regard need to bring in teacher education to this. And there are actually projects in the Muslim world. Well, actually, I mean, I can think of two projects, maybe people can add to that, but there was an Islamic teacher education program that was initiated in Canada by Dr. Nazim Memon. And I also myself ran a teacher education course for about 5 years, bringing many of the ideas of Naqib al-Atas and Ismail Faruqi and Sayyid Hussein Nasr and various other thinkers, Professor Bakar, into teacher training. And what we were trying to do was trying to untrain teachers who had already been trained and retrain them. But in Muslim majority countries, there is a great capacity for infusing this into teacher training from the onset, and that would then lead to curriculum development. The curriculum itself is another field which is really fundamental. And I think, again, when we think of curriculum at higher education, it's a very different sort of aspects to that than when we think about curriculum. So, I think what's, for me, the theme that's coming out is that there needs to be a bit more joined up thinking. But to move on...
Professor Ibrahim Osdim has been waiting. Whenever you're free, let me know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a question from Professor Abdulaziz as well. Shall I go with that one first, or we can go with Professor Ibrahim?
Professor Ibrahim first, yeah.
Okay, no problem. So Professor Ibrahim, feel free to ask your question.
Thank you very much. Hello from Istanbul. I am glad to see our Ustad Osman Bakar. Listen to him. Maybe this is a blessing of coronavirus.
Thank you.
Otherwise, you will invite him, only you will benefit from him. But this time, the work becomes like a classroom. And we have another, I just finished another webinar from 20 countries. So I think as I appreciated your work, Farah, as a teacher, what you have been doing there. But as Osman said, the problem is that there are some Muslims with postmodern ideas, they reject tradition. And there are some Muslims, they say everything is available in tradition. But as Ustad Osman said, we have to be a critical mind. We respect our tradition. We have to understand the tradition, but come up with new ideas, not stay there, not to be imprisoned by our tradition. And we have very good examples in the history of Islamic philosophy. Very revolutionary pioneers like Ibn Khaldun, as we said, like Biruni, like Ibn Sina. They have all the knowledge before them, but they come up with new theories, new ideas, new concepts. They coined new concepts. So we have to come up with new ideas. And I think it is the Islamization of knowledge. It is a short time still for this idea. It is evolved from its beginning. It is evolved to a new dimensions. As Osman said, Professor Osman said, with contribution of new generations, it will be developed more and more. Then we will have an Islamic curricula for you and for others. Even I met some Christian friends. They are also trying to learn from us or experience. And sometimes, for example, there was a workshop on Asmaul Husna in Germany. This only the Paris, they attended this course. After reading, 3 days on Ghazali's Asmaul Husna book, Asmaul Husna, they told me we are enriched by the depth of the Ghazali's penetrating vision of the Haqiqatul Asmaul Husna fil alam. So I agree with Professor Osman. I think he is happy. He saw so many good initiatives around the world about this project. I think we have to be a little bit patient. We will get more results. We are also at Üsküdar University. We are just initiated a new project in the name of holistic approach. With holistic we mean we have to understand our tradition, but we have to understand the other or colleagues from the sociology, Department of Sociology, Psychology, and Sciences, then come up with new ideas. Thank you, Professor Osman.
Thank you.
Thank
Professor.
you.
I think you
Yes.
need to connect with Dr. Farah as well. Dr. Farah, you should definitely connect with our teacher, Dr. Ibrahim as well.
Inshallah,
Over to you,
that,
Dr. Farah.
yeah, inshallah, that sounds like a very exciting project to bring different disciplines together. And interdisciplinary work is becoming more and more common, but actually it often is less interdisciplinary than we want it to be. And, you know, to bring religious scholars together into such a fold and to deal with perhaps the most pressing questions that we have now is really, really important to see that kind of developments happening. And mashallah. So we have a final question, I believe, from Professor Abdulaziz for Professor Bakar, which is, during Muslim rule under various empires, sultanates, did indigenization of their subjects' knowledge happen? For example, in India, when Ghaznavi conquered India, Biruni learned about the Hindus, but that's all. Nothing really was built on or explored. So I'm not sure I fully understand that question, but I think what the professor's asking is that we're now talking about indigenization of knowledge, but what would happen under Islamic rule? How did that function at that time?
Hello?
Professor Bakar, yes.
Oh, yes. Well, I will answer it in a more general way, because I think to provide details, as you need another discussion. In principle, important is, in principle, I think Islamic epistemology, as it developed over the centuries, has always been universal and inclusive. So Islamic epistemology wants to emphasize the universal thing, precisely because it wants to emphasize universal ideas. It means that it has to be more inclusive than the question of what is the place of indigenization. It has to be answered this way. In other words, I think it's not Islam respect Islam, wherever Islam expands, it tries to make sense of the indigenous tradition to see if it conforms to Tawhid or not. So that in its encounter with the Greek heritage, in encounter with the Persian heritage, with the Turkish heritage, in encounter with the Indian heritage, that was the spirit that was adopted. Look at the way Al-Biruni, for example. All right. So Al-Biruni went to India. He took a study, not of various disciplines. He took study of comparative religion. He studied the Hinduism, religions of the Indians, because he was interested to know in which branch of Hinduism was there the closest to the perspective of Tawhid of Islam. So that requires a lot of comparative studies. He was also a great scientist. Right? So he studied the geology of the Indian subcontinent. He studied the medicine of the Indian subcontinent. So to go into that, to go to the medical system, the pre-Islamic medical system. So precisely because Islam is a way of knowledge. Islam is a way of knowledge. Islam cannot remain indifferent to anything that claims to be knowledge. If anybody wants to claim this knowledge, then Islam is interested to know about it and to check whether that claim is acceptable or not from the universal perspective of Islam. So that was the spirit, I think, in the good old days, the day when the Muslim minds were creative. Yes, wherever Islam expanded, it took note of the heritage of that particular region or culture. I think this is something that we need to keep in mind. So because another aspect of Islam, that Islam is synthesis in the spirit. Islam created major synthesis and minor synthesis throughout Islamic history. Now that we are confronted with knowledge from the modern Western civilization, and soon from the Oriental civilization, the Eastern civilization. So I think we should be guided by the perspective of Tawhid. How can we create a new synthesis? Islam is needed to play its role again as the particular as the source of synthesis, for example, between Islamic science, the modern science, and now the postmodern science. And it's very interesting in the case of talking about postmodern science. Why postmodernism happened is precisely because of that of the new physics. Basically, it was the new physics, the quantum physics, that led in a sense to the death of the modern worldview of Newton. But to talk about this quantum physics, we have to talk about the school of Kalam now. Nowadays, so many people interested in the physics of Kalam, precisely because the physics of Kalam bears so many similarities with the new physics. Well, I think this kind of thing, basically saying that synthesis is something that instead of talking about civilization, I'm not saying no, don't, but I'm saying what is more important is the synthesis. How to create a new synthesis of knowledge in the perspective of Tawhid.
Yes, thank you for that. I think that Professor Ibrahim's point about criticality will lead us to synthesis, and through synthesis we have creativity and we move forward. But so if I can come back to Professor Ibrahim, because I believe he wants to add something to the discussion.
Yes, thank you. I just, to just support Professor Osman Bakar's argument, I am using this Ibn Khaldun's book in my critical thinking class and also in philosophy of science. And as Osman said, what is in the introduction, Biruni says why he wrote this book. Because of his perception of Islamic epistemology. What is the Indian religion is as it is, not with stereotypes. To have knowledge with it through the stereotypes, through mythology is not, it is not a habit of Muslim thinking. To know what is they really believe, why they believe. Then this is all Biruni is, devoted his life for this case. So what is to us is to be critical, to try to understand something as it is, then come up with new ideas. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I think that's a really fundamental point that Al-Biruni is sometimes described as the first ethnographer, but I don't like the term ethnography because ethnography is still looking as an outsider. And what he actually did, as Professor Ibrahim is saying, is that he approached it from how, what is this worldview? How is it built and how is it constructed? And let us understand it for itself. And it's only when we give, not respect as such, but we only give space to another worldview to do that, to understand it from itself, that we can then, once we've established that, begin to be critical about it and then bring. And this was like common practice at the time, because then what the scholars would do is they would just draw out what was relevant and what was useful, ilm al-nafiyah from that, and then take that forward. They didn't fear it. They didn't see it as something that was going to somehow pollute their thinking. They had enough confidence in their own epistemology, their own ontology, their own ways of knowing, their own belief systems to be able to do that. And I actually believe that that kind of confidence is really fundamental as well as we move forward. But I just want to say Jazakallah khairan, and thank you very much to Professor Bakar. I learned so much from you again.
But just let me add that we can see the confidence of Al-Biruni as a Muslim scholar, confidence, and a respect for knowledge. It doesn't feel to go to delve in the depth of the Indian philosophy and religion. He has a self-confidence as a Muslim scholar. He was burning for learning. This is what is important, burning for learning. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Professor Bakar, do you have any final comments?
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to have this course, and especially Professor Brian.
Okay, so just to wrap up, thank you to everybody. Jazakallah khair for all those people who tuned in and for the really amazing questions that we had. Alhamdulillah, we've had a wonderful discussion. And just to say thank you to everyone, and I'm going to sign off here. So assalamu alaikum fi amanillah from me. I'll hand over back to Dan.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Leave.
Mizan, we can't hear you.
Okay, okay.